4 things you didn't learn in seminary. Coming up next on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ, we're going to talk about some things that pastors didn't learn in seminary. I think, as we are prone to do on this podcast, let's maybe give some caveats here to the beginning. I feel like we're always kind of like trying to nuance these things a little bit in an effort to be fair, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, honesty, transparency. Maybe you did learn some of these things.
Yeah, that's right. I was joking with AJ that, as we were going through prepping for this podcast, I was like, yes, well, in reference to that, here's a book that I got in seminary on this topic. And in reference to that other thing, here's a book that I got in seminary. But I did not get my MDiv in seminary. I got, it was a Master of Arts in Religion with the focus in church leadership and church planting. So I think, in all honesty, I maybe had more of these kinds of things than the typical MDiv student gets. And I think you have to seek these things out in seminary. They're not necessarily
this is more
in the
leadership
core curriculum.
Right. It's a leadership today's topic is really some components of effective church leadership. And that is not the primary focus for a lot of people going into pastoral ministry.
Right. So you joked that maybe we should have titled this episode 4 Things You Maybe Didn't Learn in Seminary.
Anyway.
I think certainly when most people sign up for seminary and when they feel a call to ministry, they aren't thinking of these 4 things when they sign up. I think that's fair enough to say. Like, they're thinking, man, I'm going to be out there in the pulpit preaching the word of God. I'm going to be, ministering to people in their greatest time of need. They're not thinking of the 4 things that we're talking about today. I think that is safe to say.
We've never gotten a call from a church leadership team saying, can you help us with better sermons? It's always been, can you help us with better leadership functions, church organization? So, yeah, it seems like seminaries are turning out some great preachers.
Yeah, I think that's what most guys get into seminary thinking, this is what I'm going to be doing.
That's totally fair.
Yeah, so let's dive in then to these 4 things that seminary doesn't prepare you for as much, but are really an integral part to leadership and serving in ministry.
Yeah. And all 4 of these things are things that we commonly deal with church leadership teams, elder boards, pastors. And our first one is conflict management. And so everybody just cringed a little bit because if you've been in ministry for any period of time, this has come up and you're like, oh, great. What do I do with this one? And there's a lot of commonalities in conflict that comes up in the church, but everybody's different. Every situation is different. So you will definitely hit some unique situations, but there's people. Well, there you go. End of sentence. There's people. There's people, therefore there's conflict. So, and I think you kind of point out here in our first kind of sub point here, Scott, that a lot of people that do get into pastoral ministry are conflict averse, and that's not a negative thing. That's really actually thing. It can be, but to want to have good relationships with people, to want to see the church thrive and support each other. I mean, those are all honorable and desirable things and attributes.
Yeah.
But there are people that cause conflict, and if we avoid it, it doesn't help the ministry.
Yeah. I mean, there's a disproportionate percentage. Well, maybe that's not fair to say. if you go back to our disc series that we did earlier this year, I believe it was, Deep on Disc, I think was what the series was titled.
Like April, May timeframe. Yeah.
Yeah. So we went through, what does it mean to lead as a D, as an I, as an S, and a C? And, the reality is that just on a percentage basis, the majority of human beings are an S on the disc. And so it stands to reason then that there would also be the largest percentage on a percentage basis. Pastors are predominantly an S. I think this is reinforced by the fact that most people who get into ministry, they want to be, doing people stuff, and they want to counsel people, and they want to teach God's word, and these are sort of pastoral gifts, shepherding gifts. And the S stands for steady. S stands for being a people person, and so on. At any rate, as a result of that, people with the S type in their personality tend to avoid conflict as much as possible. And, some pastors, AJ, are allergic to making decisions, and that might upset people. And that is a problem. And so I think that if you are an S-type leader, or that's your tendency, conflict's never going to be easy for you. It will always be difficult. But you can learn some strategies, some techniques. You can surround yourself with leaders who are better at the conflict than you. And you have to be able to learn how to engage in healthy conflict that moves the church forward.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, I think it is absolutely a skill that can be learned. I think any of the disc, letters, wherever you fall in the disc, I think you can learn skills about ones that you may not be as strong in. So, yeah, for sure.
For sure.
All right, the next thing about conflict is there are some people that seem to just thrive on it. And they're always just going to be that thorn in your side. They never have, seems like they're never agreeable to anything. And the point here on that one is that they will waste your time, and you need to minimize the time that you allow yourself to be sucked into that stuff. And that this can be very freeing. And a couple things might happen whenever you stop giving them the attention that they demand. It could be that they actually quiet down. It could be that they actually leave whenever they're not getting the feedback that they, unhealthily desire. Right. They might decide, I'm going to go somewhere else where people will engage me with my negativity. So kind of the big takeaway here on this one is don't feed those folks.
Yeah. Well, maybe another way of putting it would be don't indulge them, lead them, don't indulge them. So, it's a little bit like, and I'm reticent to compare full-grown adults with children or something, but, if you have a kid, if your child is acting up or acting out and speaking, disrespectfully towards you as a parent, coddling your child and going, oh, what's wrong or what's going on? That's not really the best way to handle that, in my experience as a parent. You have to be firm. You can be loving and you can be kind. You don't have to blow up at them and scream at them. That's likely to make things worse. But you can just say, the answer's no. And that's the end of the discussion. And kids respond to that leadership. People do too. People so if someone is stirring up trouble, and just being stern, kind, loving, patient, all of those things, fruits of the Spirit. But to say to people, well, we can work this out. Let's have another meeting. Let me take you out to coffee. And that's fueling that conflict because they're getting the attention that they want. If you're able to stand up to them and say, no, the answer is no, we're not doing this. Very often folks will respond to that positively, actually, and they'll have more respect for you, not less.
Yeah, continuing to indulge people that are negative and hypercritical about things elevates them. It elevates them to a level of leadership that they don't deserve, and they weren't. they haven't earned. So
yeah,
I think that's good. The thing that maybe the caveat here to keep in mind is to also have a level of introspection and humility, I suppose, to be able to monitor whether they're being critical or constructive. Because it's real easy for us to become defensive when we're challenged on something. And that's a serious balancing act that needs to be monitored always. Like, are they really throwing something at me that I should deal with, or is this not constructive? So critical versus constructive is the balancing act.
I think that people tend to, based on their personality type, tend to err towards an assumption of one or the other. So someone like me, or maybe you, AJ, where we're more higher on the D end of the spectrum, we assume any pushback is critical, and really negative, and so we can push back against that, or at least I'll speak for myself. My first reaction is always to go, just ignore what they're saying, and so I have to work extra hard to be sure that I'm hearing the substance of what's being said, and to try to be humble enough and hear if there is a grain of truth in there that I need to hear and respond to. I will freely admit I'm not always great at that. Anyone in my family will attest to that. They'll be like, "Don't you dare go on some podcasts and say you're really good at that." I'm not. I still have my knee-jerk reaction. I think the other end of the spectrum, though, AJ, if you are conflict averse, you might be someone who your instinct is to go, "Oh, they're just being constructive. Oh, I'm sure what they're saying is true."
Yeah.
And you shouldn't
just accept and take that on.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe this may be just a commonality among the D's, because you could have been completely speaking about me in the first part of that. But I guess this maybe also supports what we started off saying, is that you can learn, wherever you fall on the disc, you can learn skills, because I completely ditto exactly what you said. I would initially react as though you're being critical and I'm right, and I have to just monitor that in myself and go, okay, let's not assume that I am right on everything, and I can actually listen to what people have to say. So
yeah. So conflict management is hard, and what you need to learn about that, I think, hinges greatly on what your personality disposition is.
Yeah.
And so maybe this wasn't in the notes, and maybe I need to go back and add them, but maybe go back to that Deep on Disc series. You can search for that, DISC, Deep on Disc series, on the podcast, and because we do talk about conflict and how to manage those kinds of things in that series, it would be helpful.
Yeah. Yep. That was back in 2022. If it's 2050 and you're listening to this, that was way back in 2022.
Yeah, good point.
So our next piece is change management. If your church is not one that already has a culture of things, always kind of flowing and making some different things happen, then this is obviously more of an issue. So not to use the word traditional in any kind of negative sense, but if your church has just been more always doing things very similarly, then change management is more of an issue if you decide then to do something that would be significantly different than what you normally do. So, but communication is critical in change management, which this might also come back to perhaps something on the disc, whether you've been a good communicator or not. That's definitely a skill that can be learned. But communicating the why behind change is always the first place I think that we need to start. When people understand, that there is a good reason for doing something different, it always makes that jagged pill perhaps go down a little bit easier. So communication in change is definitely the place to start.
Yeah, communication really is critical. It depends on, if we're talking small change or big change, obviously more thought has to go into big change than small change in terms of communication. But in my opinion, the bottom line is change in church boils down to church politics. And I know, like, trust me, I hear it all the time from pastors that, oh, I hate church politics. I hate this, hate that. I think that does you no good. Church politics are inevitable. The word politics itself is a derivative of a word in Greek that just means public. Anything that's public is political. And managing church politics is a critical component of leadership. You'll never meet a pastor who's really successful who isn't really good at church politics. Now, I will want to, I guess, clarify that and say that being manipulative through church politics is bad. Toxic church politics are bad. But you can become good at church politics in a way that honors God and honors people. And managing church politics really boils down to managing relationships with people. So knowing some people have more influence than others in the church. Winning people over who have influence over a certain area and doing so in advance of announcing something in a big way, that's a good thing. There's nothing dishonest. There is nothing negative or toxic about any of that. And so I guess my encouragement to you, pastor listening to this, is stop hating church politics and resenting them and complaining about them and learn to master them. And it does you no good to say, oh, I hate church politics. They exist. So instead, learn to master them and to master it in a way that is godly. And that's, to me, change management boils down to that. Do you know how to negotiate people and those relationships? And if you can do that, you're going to be okay.
Well, we have systems already in place in which this is completely acceptable. We have, like an elder board or a church council in which decisions are made through, sometimes some level of negotiation or talking through details till consensus comes. We have committees. Some churches have tons of committees. We work through all those. It almost just comes down to like the final two components, and that's like who is perceived as being a leader and all the rest of the church. That's when we call it politics. Up until that point, we seem to have kinder terms or ideas about making decisions. So
sure. We have polity and then we have politics. And both are important. But to me, change management comes down to that. So why do so many pastors just totally crash and burn? And it's very often it's a failure to manage the politics in ways that are completely avoidable. If you're a new pastor, you just started as a lead pastor at some church, it's almost cliche at this point to say don't implement a bunch of change in the first 5 minutes because that's obvious. But then what should you be doing? If you shouldn't be implementing a bunch of change, what are you supposed to do? Sit on your thumbs? No. Find the 10 most influential people in the church and get to know them. I'm not saying try to get on their good side or manipulate them in some way and butter them up. That I'm not telling you to do that. I'm saying get to know them. Listen to them. Find out what they care about and see if it's something that you care about too. Find areas to align with them. So I don't know. This is one of those areas where it's also like technology is another one of those things where pastors go, well, I'm not very good with technology. I'm like, well, get with the program. It's time to stop using that as an excuse. When I hear pastors say, oh, I hate church politics, I'm like, well, then you're in the wrong job because it's part of the job.
Yeah. Scott, throwing it down. There you go. But tell you what, vision goes a long way in managing change. And this is sort of like the why, this is that I mentioned at the top of this point. You could kind of, these words are somewhat interchangeable, explaining the why behind change and speaking and preaching vision for the church goes a long way because, and this is, I guess you could call this a component of politics. You're explaining a position. You're making a compelling reason for it.
Yeah, make a case.
You're gathering people to come alongside you in something that you think is important. So, I don't know. If you've thought of vision being terribly outside of that kind of simplistic explanation, you don't really need to. I mean, it really is, now when we there's a spiritual aspect to it. We're perceiving what God wants our church to do together. But then it's you. It's left on you to communicate that and to gather people in to be a part of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Our third point today, our third management piece here is time management. So getting a little bit more nuts and boltsy here in just how you're managing this very, very limited and important resource that you have. So first of all, I mean, this is, like I said, this is nuts and bolts, man. Block out time on your calendar. Time blocking is your friend. If you start every Monday with a clean slate of, well, we'll see what comes up this week, you've already lost. You will never prioritize, and you'll never get done the things that are most important.
Yeah. So to piggyback off of that, you can. We actually did a whole episode on this topic, episode 66. If you want to go to malphursgroup.com/66 and read it, we advocate thinking about your week in thirds. Like a third of your week should be spent on what I've titled like creative or organizational work. This is going to depend on a little bit on what your position is. So this is, if you're a lead pastor or teaching pastor, this is maybe where you'd throw in your sermon writing, these things that, it's thinking work, it's brain work that maybe results in something that's written, working on a strategy, working on that kind of thing. Think about a second third of your week being spent on administration. We all hate returning emails and phone calls and just dealing with tasks, but it's an inevitable part of every job everywhere. So think about a third of your week needs to be spent dedicated to that. And a third of your week should be spent on what I'm calling leadership development, but just think of it as discipleship. Actually being with people, managing people, leading people, building into people. And to AJ's point, you can segment off your week so that you're only available certain times. If your whole calendar is open to everyone at any time, then you won't have time to do the other things. So intentionally mark off on your calendar this time. And most pastors do this for sermon writing. They'll block off a certain amount of time for sermon writing, but block off time for the other things as well. And then you only have certain time slots available for meetings and that kind of thing. I would tack onto this. If you've got a secretary who's managing your calendar, then maybe you don't need to worry about this. But if you're managing your own calendar, using a system like Calendly, which is what we use here on our team, it helps immensely. People can only schedule a meeting with us, AJ, when the calendar says that we are available. And sometimes when it says we're unavailable, it's because we actually are in another meeting. But sometimes it's because we've blocked off time to do other things that we have determined are important, and we need to use our time on that, like recording this podcast, for example. So just use tools like that to help you manage your time.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, you can just say no. So if you have left a bit of margin in your calendar and something comes up, it's okay to say no to it, obviously, depending on what it is and the actual severity. But yeah, you just need to sometimes learn to say no. And there's just a lot of people that find that really difficult. They just have this compulsion to say yes to everything. And you've heard the term probably tyranny of the urgent, and it can take over all of your free time.
Yeah, I would say full transparency. I'm not conflict averse at all, but this is one, saying no to opportunities is something that I struggle with. Like, to me, I'm like, I don't want to pass this up. I want to say yes to this, and just recognize that a yes to anything is a no to something else. So recognize that if you're saying yes to this meeting or whatever it is, what are you saying no to? And then do a little bit of an opportunity cost adjustment and go, hey, is this worth it for me?
All right, so let's move on. Our fourth one is organizational management. So we've covered a lot of management areas, but we've got to still keep in mind, you are probably, if you're listening to this, you're probably a high-level leader in your church. You may not be a senior pastor or an elder or whatever your church might have at the senior level, but you probably are making decisions in your church if you're interested in what we have to say week to week. But having a clear authority structure is absolutely necessary for effective decision making in the church. And this is something, I don't know, I guess I shouldn't be surprised anymore, Scott, but we still come across churches that really have not delineated authority and a hierarchy of decision making. And I haven't met a healthy church yet that was like, we're a little bit free flowing on that. It's kind of unclear. But we are great at making disciples and sharing the gospel and having people serve. That has not been a conversation I've come across yet. And have had another one recently in which it was really unclear about who people should go to for a particular thing or this other thing. It's just not clear who has the authority to make final decisions on things, and it causes an element, a level of chaos in the church. Not that the walls are on fire, but it causes confusion. And when you interject confusion into any organization, you reduce your effectiveness at living out any kind of positive strategies that you're working towards.
Yeah, I mean, have you ever watched an American football game where the teams just keep punting? No one ever scores. It's just a bunch of punting. Watching some churches, it's a lot like that. The game is very boring and nothing ever happens, and you just want it to go away and turn off. When you don't have clear lines of authority, it's just every committee, every team, every ministry, every leader punts to the next person, and nothing ever happens. And it's just an exercise in futility, and it makes you want to go nuts. So have that clear structure like you're talking about. I also want to encourage you as a leader to learn how to balance direct and indirect leadership. Like, when do I need to lead this myself, and when do I need to lead through someone else? You need to learn how to balance those things and don't become the bottleneck for every decision, for all strategic action. That's really, really, really important.
Yeah, I think kind of the difference that's happening there is that you are the chief decision maker and you decide on the fly what to delegate out versus having a pre-designed system in the church, an organizational system in which certain decisions are automatically going to be made by somebody other than you. So it's really, it's developing a system for decision making in which, as you're saying, that you don't become the bottleneck or any one person becomes the bottleneck. This is making decisions ahead of time about who will make decisions. Pre-delegated authority. That makes for more efficient decision making in the church, and usually more effective, because what we've done is decided who is best at making these decisions in a timely manner, which speeds up everything. It's at the end of the year, you're gonna have done more ministry because of that system being in place than you would have kind of like the free-flowing calendar. On Monday, we'll kind of figure out, we'll see how the week flows. That happens in organizational management as well. We'll just kind of see what comes up. We'll figure out who's best to handle that. All of that takes time. And every time you pull another 5 minutes, another 10 minutes, another 30 days out of making a decision, all you've done is delayed the effectiveness of your ministry and perhaps, making more disciples. So
yeah, we've talked about this before on the podcast. This like churches are plagued by an inherent disadvantage in that just because of the way that they're structured and the fact that you're so reliant on volunteers that it's impossible largely for decisions to get made quickly. you deliberate on something, and then you go, oh, let's table this discussion. We'll make a decision at our next meeting. Well, the next meeting is next month, and then you have to get everybody back up to speed. What did we talk about last time? And unless it's a crisis, and then a decision won't get made quickly. And if it's a crisis, that's the worst time to be making a decision. You're probably not going to be making a decision with any degree of clarity. And so you need good systems in place that are thinking 2, 3, 5, 6, 9, 12 months out, so that you are pre-planning your decision making. So you're not always behind the 8 ball. Most churches are always planning reflexively rather than proactively, and they're not thinking further down the field. So you have to bake the slowness of decision making into your leadership cake. And the way to integrate that in a way that doesn't get you behind is to catch yourself up on what decisions need to be made up to now, and then try to get ahead. So have systems in place, systems that can make decisions on their own further down the line, so that not every decision is a senior leadership decision, but also have systems of planning, so that the strategic decisions that need to be made 6 months from now, you can start talking about today. And if you can get those systems in place, then you'll be in a better shape. And this is the kind of organizational management that it does take time to learn it in practice, but also no one is preparing you for this in seminary.
Yeah, that's key. That's honestly, Scott, that's a next level thing for any church. To master this is a game changer. So, yeah. All right. Hey, shameless plug, Malphurs Group Leadership Pipeline Design can help you get that in place. So you can find more information about that at malphursgroup.com. But anyway, all right. So, Scott, we've covered some great management areas in the church that you may not have learned too much about in seminary: in conflict management, change management, time management, and organizational management.
Yeah.
So thanks for being with us today.
Seminaries are doing better. I was just going to say the seminaries are doing better now than they were, even a decade ago, much less 20 or 30 years ago. But I still think, for a lot of guys, these kinds of classes are electives. They're things that I need to learn Hebrew and Greek. And if I learn some of that leadership stuff. I'm just telling you, you're going to spend way more, and those of you who are in leadership, you're listening to this podcast, you know this, you spend way more time in the boardroom dealing with issues and with people than you spend in your Greek lexicon. And I'm not saying the Greek is not important. I am just saying it pays to be prepared for the rest of what leadership is.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul the Apostle spent an awful lot of time dealing with leadership issues. Wrote a couple books about them. Maybe check them out.
That's right.
Hey, thanks for being with us. This was episode 162 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. So you could read today's show notes at malphursgroup.com/162. We are thankful that you're with us. We would appreciate you considering how you can help support our ministry, as we are a nonprofit and we are resourcing the church all around the world with workshops, with printed resources, with audio and video. And it takes resources of the finance nature to make that happen. So if your church would like to talk about being mission partners with us to make that happen, we would love to speak with you. You can email us at leadership@malphursgroup.com or go to malphursgroup.com/donate to learn more. Thanks again. We'll be back with you again next week.